Hey guys, how's it going today? Hope everybody's doing good. Welcome to SproutsCast Tuesday edition. Story time. Hi, Mrs. Good.
Hello, Mr. Good. How are you doing
I'm
today?
doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here and read some more of our story and do a fun craft at the
Yeah,
end.
don't forget to stick around and sign in. Make sure you're putting who you are and say hi to me and say hi to Mrs. Good. And we enjoy that. We really do. It encourages us. And we're here saying hi to you guys. So hey, say hi to us in the comments and let us know that you're here. And who have we been studying, Mrs. Good?
We've been studying about Jim Elliott, a missionary to the Quechua Indians in Ecuador.
Okay, so real quick, uh, what does a missionary do? That's not everybody understands actually what a missionary does. What does a missionary do, Mrs. Good?
So, for those of you that are joining and didn't hear when we first started, missionaries are people that go to other places, whether it be here in the United States or in another country, and they tell others about Jesus and how they can know him as their personal savior. And sometimes they can't go over just specifically with that's going to be their job speaking Bible to people. Sometimes the country won't let them in like that. And so sometimes they actually have to get a job over there, like a nurse or a doctor, or set up equipment or a teacher or something like that. And then while they are in that field, then they're able to minister to the people there to tell them about Jesus.
You know, our lesson on Sunday, SproutsCast Sunday School, our lesson was about Paul and Silas, right?
Yes.
Something that Paul did when he didn't quite have enough money was he was a tent maker. So he made tents and stuff, and he partnered with some people, and I guarantee you those people heard the gospel, and so that's what missionaries do. And sometimes they have to have jobs. And you know, like here we're complaining about having to stay at home during this time and not being able to go out and do things and stuff. But think about the missionaries around the world. They're in some pretty tough conditions most of the time. They don't have the same uh, what do you call them, Mrs. Good?
Same comforts?
Yeah, the comforts, the creature comforts that we enjoy. You know, being able to watch TV and stuff like that. They don't have that stuff. You know, they're missionaries, and their purpose is to reach the world with the gospel. And what does the gospel mean? It means good news, right? So they're taking the good news to people that don't necessarily have the good news. And so this has been a really good time learning about Jim Elliott and his missionary journey. And so, what do you think? Should we jump into it, Mrs.
Yeah,
Good?
let's go ahead and jump right into it. We are going to start chapter 6 in our book about Jim Elliott, One Great Purpose.
And don't forget to stick around afterwards for the craft. Mrs. Good has a great craft for you today, and it's a craft that you'll have fun with, not just look at. So
Yes,
it's going to be good.
You can play with this
Yeah.
one.
All right.
All right, so with that, we are going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 6 is called Shandai at Last. At 6 a.m. on Friday, August 15th, 1952, an overloaded bus lurched out of the marketplace in Quito. As it began its twisted downhill trip to Shell Mera, Jim Elliott perched quietly in one of the narrow, hard seats. Beside him sat a young boy who looked shyly out the window. He was one of 18 boys from Quito whom Jim and Pete were escorting to Shelmera, where they would all participate in a week-long boys' camp. After helping with the camp, Jim and Pete would move on to Shandai. As the bus rumbled along, Jim tried to sort through his feelings. On the one hand, he was excited. He was finally on his way to live in Shandai, and he relished the challenges that lay ahead. After 6 months of sitting around in Quito learning Spanish, he was finally going to be a missionary. In spite of being excited about what lay ahead, Jim felt sad. Yes, every mile on the bus carried him away from Quito was a mile closer to Shandai, but it was also a mile farther away from Betty. Jim had risen extra early that morning just so that he could walk one last time past the house where she was staying. He had wanted to yell up to her window to see if she was awake, but in the end he had just stood there and silently said goodbye. Now that he was on his way to Shandai on the east side of the Andes Mountains, while Betty was going to San Miguel on the west side, he wondered when they would see each other next. The bus wound its way past Mount Cotopaxi, shrouded in swirling morning mist, and then headed south through Ambato and Baños until finally, late in the afternoon, it screeched to a halt in Shelmera. As Jim and Pete and 18 boys scrambled from the bus, Dr. Tidmarsh was waiting for them. He had come down to Shelmara several days earlier to help set up the boys' camp. As Jim walked around the bus a couple times to get the circulation in his legs going, the bus driver climbed onto the roof of the bus and unloaded their belongings. Jim checked to make sure all the bags were there, and when he indicated they were, the bus disappeared in a cloud of dust. Jim and Pete and Dr. Tidmarsh led the boys to the Berean Bible Institute, where the camp was to be held. Jim enjoyed his week at camp. Everyone arose at 6 a.m. when they had café, a light breakfast of sweet bread rolls and hot chocolate. After café, it was on to group Bible study and singing, followed by a morning snack of bananas and roasted corn kernels. Then it was time for a team game. Soccer was the boys' favorite. After lunch, they took a siesta, or a nap, compensation for getting up so early. When the siesta was over, everyone went swimming in the stream about 10 minutes away, and then after dinner, there was another short Bible study, and then off to bed. When Jim wasn't with the boys, he was following Nate Saint around, trying to gain every piece of practical advice he could about living in the jungle. Nate and his wife Marge had lived in Shelmera since 1948. Jim was particularly interested in Nate's garden. He took cuttings from some of the most successful plants growing there and stowed them away meticulously in his backpack for the trip to Shandai. By the end of the week, he had collected, among other things, roses, geraniums, hibiscus cuttings, coffee bean plants, poinsettia seedlings, and a variety of orchid roots. Jim was itching to start his first tropical garden when he finally moved to Shandai. 1 week after the group arrived in Shelmera, the sun rose golden across the eastern jungle. Jim was brimming with excitement as he loaded his belongings into the MAF's Piper Cruiser, which Nate had just flown to Shelmera from the United States. The plane was painted the same distinctive yellow as the other MAF plane, a Piper Pacer, in which Jim had flown during the aerial survey. Nate carefully supervised the loading of the plane. He made sure the weight of their heavy backpacks and other belongings was distributed evenly in the back. When they had loaded enough for the first trip, Pete and Dr. Tidmarsh climbed in. They would fly to Pano, northeast of Shelmera, and then Nate would return for Jim and the rest of their belongings. Nate cranked the engine of the Piper Cruiser until it burst to life. The engine purred smoothly while Nate checked his instruments. Nate set the flaps and revved the engine slightly, and the plane crawled forward. Nate taxied across the road to Ambato and out to the end of the runway. As Jim watched, Nate gunned the engine, commanding the yellow plane to pick up speed and raced down the runway. Moments later, the Piper was clear of the ground and climbing into the still morning air. It banked to the left and headed away from Shelmera. Jim watched until the plane had vanished in the brilliant glow of the morning sun. About 1.5 hours later, the buzz of Nate's plane filled the air as Nate circled around Shelmera and came in for a landing. As soon as the yellow plane taxied to a halt in front of the MAF hangar, Jim began to load up the last of the cargo. Soon he and Nate were aloft, zipping along above the jungle, headed to Pano, the nearest airstrip to Shandai. As Jim watched the mass of green vegetation pass, he marveled at the ease and convenience of flying. It would take the plane about 25 minutes to cover the 35 miles to Pano. Nate explained to Jim that the same journey on foot would take several days of difficult hiking through dense jungle. Jim now understood why Dr. Tidmarsh had told him that cleaning and repairing the overgrown airstrip at Shandai needed to be their first priority. As the MAF plane glided effortlessly above the lush jungle, Jim thought about all that lay ahead. Dr. Tidmarsh was going to lead them over land to Shandai from Pano, and then spend a month with them while Jim and Pete set things up. It certainly seemed that they were going to be busy right from the start. Dr. Tidmarsh had plans for them to build another house next to the one already there after they cleared and repaired the airstrip. In addition, several other buildings were badly in need of repair. And then there was the boys' school to reopen. On top of all this, Jim would need to learn the Quechua language. Even though some of the Quechuas could understand Spanish, Dr. Tidmarsh had informed Jim and Pete that learning the local dialect as quickly as possible was vital to the success of their ministry. The sharp banking turn of the Pipper cruiser snapped Jim back to the moment at hand. Nate trimmed the plane and set the flaps and throttle for landing. To Jim, the jungle seemed to be rising ominously close to the plane. But Nate didn't seem all that concerned. Right about the time Jim expected the tops of the trees to start slapping the bottom of the plane, a clearing appeared. About 50 feet past the edge of the clearing, the wheels of the Pipper abruptly touched down on the ground. The whole plane vibrated as Nate cut back on the throttle and guided the plane to the end of the airstrip where Pete was waiting with Dr. Tidmarsh and a group of Indians he had hired to help carry their belongings. As soon as Nate cut the engine, Jim jumped out of the plane and began unloading the gear. After saying goodbye to Nate Saint, the three men hoisted their overstuffed backpacks onto their backs, while the Indians divided up the rest of the belongings. The party then set off for Shandai, a 3-hour trek from Pano. Jim fell in step behind Pete, while Dr. Tidmarsh led the way. The Indians followed behind Jim. In the jungle, huge kapok trees towered above, providing shade not only for the travelers, but also for an amazing array of mosses and lichens. Giant air ferns clung to the trunks of the trees, and translucent butterflies fluttered casually down the long, narrow trail. Occasionally, Dr. Tidmarsh signaled for the group to stop. When they did, Jim would sometimes catch a glimpse of a multicolored snake slithering into the undergrowth. Birds squawked around them, and often when Jim looked up, he would see spider monkeys swinging casually from tree to tree. As he trudged over huge roots and around muddy pits, he wished he could swing freely like the monkeys above. Dr. Tidmarsh kept glancing at his watch. He was pleased with the time they were making, but he kept reminding Jim and Pete to keep up their pace. Finally, as golden late afternoon sunlight filtered lazily through the green canopy above them, the thin trail widened out into a man-made clearing. At the far end of the clearing, overlooking a steep bluff, stood a simple, split bamboo hut. "Here we are," announced Dr. Tidmarsh cheerfully. "Home sweet home." As he spoke, several figures emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing. With shouts of recognition, they raced up to Dr. Tidmarsh and threw their arms around him. Jim smiled as they chattered away in the Quechua language. He supposed they were telling Dr. Tidmarsh all that had happened since he'd left. They seemed to speak at a breakneck speed, interspersing their conversation with loud rounds of laughter. As he listened to Dr. Tidmarsh, Jim hoped he would soon be able to speak Quechua as fluent as the doctor. After 15 minutes of joyous conversation, the Quechua Indians escorted the three missionaries to the far end of the clearing, where the tall hut stood on piles 3 feet off the ground. Jim, who had seen the structures only from the air, was surprised at how high its thatched roof was. The roof sat like an oversized hat, twice as high as the walls that supported it. "This is where I lived with my family," said Dr. Tidmarsh, looking at the hut. "It's in better condition than I expected. Let's see what it looks like inside." The three of them climbed the wooden steps that led inside. The interior was surprisingly large. The living area was divided from the sleeping area by a ceiling-to-floor curtain. A couple of rugs covered the floor, but they were littered with dead bugs. Jim, who had expected the house to be in much worse condition, strolled into the sleeping area and laid down his backpack. The Indians deposited the rest of the gear in the living area while Dr. Tidmarsh lit the Coleman stove. The small stove burst to life with a hiss. "I thought we'd have some canned baked beans for dinner," he said with a smile. "But don't worry. Tomorrow I'll show you how to eat like a local." Jim grinned. He knew Dr. Tidmarsh would enjoy watching him eat jungle foods for the first time, especially the foods that wiggled. An hour later, the three of them had eaten dinner and cleaned up. Now it was time for bed. It had been a long, exhausting day. Jim took one last look from the screened window before turning in for the night. The silver reflection of the moon danced on the surface of the Otunyaku River, which flowed swiftly along the bottom of the bluff. The whole scene was even more beautiful than Jim had imagined it would be. Jim rolled out his sleeping bag and laid down on top of it. It was much too hot to crawl inside. He lay on his back for a long time, listening to the symphony of sounds around his new home. A troop of monkeys squawked in the distance. A bird made a raucous call from a nearby tree, and the low rumble of water from the river filled the night with soothing monotone. When Jim awoke the next morning, a broad smile across his face, Jim Elliott was about to begin his long-awaited first day of missionary work in the jungle. Jim studied the hut he had just spent the night in and tried to think of how to describe it to Betty in a letter. It was nowhere near as modern as the MAF house in Shelmera, but it was comfortable nonetheless. The walls were made from split bamboo and the floors were from wood planks. The ceiling consisted of thick tar paper nailed to the rafters. As the men ate pineapple and rice porridge for breakfast, Dr. Tidmarsh explained that huge bats lived in the high peaks of the roof. The tar paper stopped the bat droppings from landing on people, or in a plate of food, or a glass of drink. Jim was grateful for the paper as he sipped his coffee. The next few days were a blur of new experiences and images. Just as he had promised, Dr. Tidmarsh introduced Jim and Pete to jungle food. Jim was able to stomach most things. He even enjoyed some of them. He ate heart of chanta palm, similar to the nutty flavor of a chestnut, papaya, avocado, all shapes and colors of banana-related fruits, herba lucia, a green tea made from jungle leaves, and a fat chanta worm. He managed to swallow the worm, but just barely. Dr. Tidmarsh, though, smacked his lips with delight after eating a half dozen of them. The first undertaking was to start the job of reclaiming the overgrown airstrip. It was a huge task and would take a number of weeks to complete. To help with the task, Dr. Tidmarsh hired about 20 Quechua men with machetes. The workers approached the job enthusiastically, although their enthusiasm didn't stop some of them from wandering off into the jungle for unofficial breaks. Keeping track of the men and keeping them working was a full-time job. But Dr. Tidmarsh knew how to talk with them. The days quickly fell into a pattern. Not wanting to waste any natural light, the three missionaries would rise at 6 a.m. Soon after the sun rose. They would sit outside and shave on the steps one at a time. As they did so, a group of Indians would gather around to watch. Someone in the group would mimic their actions, pretending to skim a razor over his chin and cheek. Howls of laughter would follow the others. Some of the Indians would stay and watch the trio eat breakfast, which usually consisted of fresh fruits and a stick of steamed manioc, topped off with a mug of good strong coffee. At first, Jim found the lack of privacy difficult. Wherever he went, and whatever he did, there would always seem to be someone staring and giggling. But telling the Quechuas that staring and giggling was rude would have achieved nothing. They simply didn't have the same need for privacy as Jim and Pete had. Jim knew he was the one who would have to adjust to the situation. After breakfast at 7:15 a.m., it was time to call Marge Saint on the hand crank radio. The men would let her know that everything was fine and give her a simple list of supplies they needed flown in. Of course, until they got their airstrip cleared, supplies would have to be flown to Pano and collected from there by foot, a trek of 6 hours round trip. When radio contact ended, the three men would study the Bible and pray for a while. Then Dr. Tidmarsh would send them to go and gather a workforce for the day, while Jim and Pete passed the study time learning the Quechua language. It wasn't easy at first, but the men pressed on because soon they would be on their own, without the benefit of Dr. Tidmarsh's knowledge of the language. Throughout the rest of the day, the men would alternate between supervising the workers and studying the language. Wherever they went, Jim and Pete would carry a notebook and pen to write down new Quechua words to learn. As they worked on getting the Quechua school back in order, Dr. Tidmarsh had a teacher flown in to teach the students once class resumed. Dr. Tidmarsh's month with Jim and Pete passed quickly. The young missionaries bade Dr. Tidmarsh goodbye as he set out for Pano to be flown back to Shelmera. They were sad to see him go, but they knew he would be back. The doctor planned to return at regular intervals to stay with Jim and Pete and help their ministry along. On September 30th, several days after Dr. Tidmarsh had left, Jim and Pete rose earlier than normal to make a final inspection of the newly cleared runway. They checked to make sure there were no holes unfilled or rocks left in the tiny airstrip. When they were satisfied that everything was in order, they walked back into their hut for breakfast. At 7:15 a.m., they made their regular call to Marge Saint. Excitedly, Jim told Marge that the airstrip at Shandai was finished and ready for use. By early afternoon, nearly 150 Quechua Indians had gathered with Jim and Pete besides the airstrip and were anxiously waiting. They heard Nate Saint's Piper Cruiser long before they could see it. The plane flew in low from the southwest. Nate banked into a tight turn and circled the new runway twice, checking it out before he attempted to land. When he was satisfied that everything was in order, he lined his plane up for a landing. Jim watched as the wheels thumped down onto the new airstrip and the plane glided to a halt. As soon as Nate cut the engine, the crowd surrounded the plane and helped unload the goods he had on board for the missionaries. After 20 minutes on the ground, Nate took off to service the other mission stations in the Orient. Jim went to sleep that night very content and relieved that they now had a direct lifeline to the outside world. And that is the end of chapter 6. So we're going to leave off there. Next week we will read chapter 7 called Losses and Gains. So make sure that you tune in for that. So now we're going to rearrange things a little bit. Bear with us for a second. We're going to get things turned around a little bit so that I can show you exactly how to do this craft. What we are going to do today is we are going to make a ping pong ball launcher. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. I'll wait for everything to get set up and I'll scoot forward here a little bit. So here's what you need. You need one of these little Gatorade bottles. This one is a 12 ounce. So you need a Gatorade bottle, empty. You are going to need a piece of yarn or some thicker string, probably close. You could probably cut it 12 inches and then you can trim it off afterwards. And you're going to need some kind of a bead. This is a little wood bead. You can use, maybe a button might work if you can get the string through it. You can use one of the pony beads, whatever you'd like to do, but you need a little bead with your string. You need a ping pong ball. Now you can get these really, really cheap at Dollar Tree. They'll sell them in a package of like 6 for $1. So ping pong balls are really easy to get. You need 2 rubber bands, 1, 2, about the same size if you can get them. So 2 rubber bands and a pair of scissors, which I left over here. Let me grab them. Okay, so, and a pair of scissors. So the first thing that you're going to want to do, and I already did it ahead of time, is you want to cut your ping pong bottle. If you can see, I cut it about in half. So you want to cut the bottom portion of your bottle off. That's the first step. And then your next step is going to be, you're going to take the lid off, and you can take either a nail or you could screw something into it. You could use your scissors and poke a hole in it, but you want to poke a hole right in the center of the lid. You want to get a hole right in the center of that because you're going to thread your string through it here in a little bit. So once you've got your bottle cut and you've got the hole in the lid, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to look at the top part where you cut your bottle. What you want to do is get a black Sharpie, if you need it. You may not need it, but you're going to make 4 slits in the top of your Gatorade bottle, okay? And you want it to be kind of crisscrossed from each other so it's in an X. So there's a slit here at this corner and then a slit at this corner. And then on a bottom, there's a slit in this corner and a slit in this corner. And you can use the scissors to do that. It'll cut through the plastic really, really easy. So it'll make kind of an X shape like that in the bottom of your Gatorade bottle. All right, so when you get that part done, you can take your thread and you can thread it through your bead. That'll be the next thing, and you want to tie a knot so that your bead or your button or whatever you're using is attached to it. You have to have the bead on there or it is not going to work. Your ping pong ball will just fall out. It won't snap and pop out of the bottle. So you want to make sure you get that on there pretty good and tight. And then you're going to take your lid. You want to thread it through kind of like the top of the lid. So if it was on the bottle like this, screwed on, you want to stick the string through the top of the lid so it would go into the bottle, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick and get that stuck through. You'll have to poke it through with something. I'm going to use these scissors and I'm going to stuff it in there. Don't tie a knot in it yet because we have to tie it to something, but we got to get the string through there. All right, there we go. So I've got my bottle lid on there. The bead is stuck now like that, and this would actually go into the bottle like so. So your bead is on the top of the lid, your string is coming through the bottle. All right, so now we need to get our rubber bands on there. The rubber bands can be a little bit more tricky, so you guys might need help with that. You need your rubber band to go in. You're going to make a cross is what you're going to do, and I'll show it to you. So you're going to thread the rubber band through one hole to the opposite corner. And it's going to kind of loop through or loop around the other side. So you can see it kind of makes a half circle like that. I think I actually need to get it into the other one. No, I don't. It's good. Okay. And then you put the other one the other way. Where's my other slit? Just like so. You got to cut your edges down probably a good 1/2 inch to 1 inch into the bottle. And there you can see it forms an X inside. So that's how you want it to be. Now what you're going to do is you're going to get your thread and you're actually going to tie it around that center X in there. You want to leave yourself a little bit of a string, but not a whole lot on the outside. And then you're going to go ahead and tie a knot on that, do a double knot, and then cut off the extra. So let me get that tied together real quick. There's one knot. And Almost. Me and my fingers are not working together right now with this bottle. You guys with smaller fingers are probably going to be able to do this a lot easier. So there's knot number 2. Now you can see I got a little bit hanging off. I've got it tied, but I've got extra here. So I am going to snip that off. Okay, now your ping pong ball will set right in there like that. Now, the plastic actually is a little bit sharp, so be careful. It's not too bad. It's not going to probably cut you unless you're just really trying to manhandle it a little bit. But the edges where the rubber bands are, if you pull this too hard, the plastic bottle might cut the ping pong ball. Okay, so you got to be careful with that. But if you pull the string, it pulls the rubber bands down, and then when you let go, there you go. You got a ping pong ball launcher. So you guys can do that. Remember, you need the water bottle. You need some kind of a bead or a button. You need your string, and you need the hole poked in the top of it, some rubber bands, and a ping pong ball, and you'll be good to go. You guys can have fun with these, and I hope that you really enjoy it. You'll have to maybe take some videos and see how far you can launch your ping pong balls and post it on here. Do some measurements, have a ping pong ball launching contest so you can get theirs to go the farthest. Hope you guys have a great time. Enjoy your craft, and we'll see you next week.